knife that I'm working on is called a Puukko. Now there's no such thing as the perfect knife, but if there was, I reckon this would be it. It's a physical textbook on knife design, and I'm going to tell you why. Now the Puukko is a very simple knife. It's not going to be winning any beauty competitions for profile, but it's a profile that you don't really see very often, or do you? One thing that will instantly strike you as familiar about a Puukko is the fact that it looks like a steak knife. There's a perfectly straight back, and it is the lines of where the edge is and the spine are run parallel for almost the entirety of the knife before going into a very distinct belly right there up to the tip. Now, there's not much more to it than that. Traditionally, they have no ricasso whatsoever, and every maker of Puukko likes to add their own personal flair. I like to add just a very small bit of ricasso to mine, and I tend to do a narrower blade than some makers do. But all of those design elements are still there. Now, the reason I say this is a physical textbook on knife design is simply because it is such a functional knife and one that's often overlooked. And it's my opinion that people getting into knife making, or even people who have been in knife making for quite a while, should study the Puukko just to see how versatile it is. Now, we have knives for lots of different tasks, and those knives are designed specifically for those tasks. For example, you wouldn't take a Nakiri Japanese kitchen knife into the woods to use as a bushcraft knife because it's not really designed to do that. Just the same thing, you wouldn't take a fish filleting knife into a knife fight. Like, different knives have different purposes. It's hard to whittle with a filleting knife. It's possible, but there's different purposes behind the designs of profiles, edge geometry, bevels, silhouette of knives, the tip shape and angles. The Puukko does almost everything, well, not just average, but exceptionally well. Now, its history originates in Finland. It's traditionally a Finnish knife. Despite that, it's seen across Scandinavia, and people take great pride in their Puukkos. It was sort of a thing that a young boy would receive to symbolize that he is now a man. But it could also be used to represent a person's wealth or a family's wealth by having particularly ornate Puukkos. This is more in more recent history where the people who carried them weren't relying on them as much. These harken back to a time where people relied heavily on knives. These were an important part of their survival. And the Sami people used called a Sami knife, which was basically a large Puukko, often sometimes with a blade length up to 500 millimeters long. And it was expected to be able to cut through reindeer antler. So these knives have seen some hard use and should be built for hard use. Oftentimes you'll see them with fullers forged into the blade to add extra strength for larger ones. But one of the main reasons they were used was for wood carving. And this shape is beautiful for wood carving, and it's in fact why most of the Puukkos that you'll see will have no ricasso whatsoever, and why mine has such a short ricasso. And it's simply because when you are carving and you bear up on the knife, the most possible pressure you can apply is right here near your handle and not out here. And so the further down the blade goes, the more pressure you can apply. This long straight edge also makes stripping bark off things very easy to do. And you'll notice that the point is not particularly acute, although some Puukko that were designed specifically for hunting had a slight downward sweep. And the reason for that, if you're not hunted before, if you're trying to get the pelt off of an animal cleanly without poking holes through it, you need to have quite an obtuse angle at the tip. If you have too narrow a tip like this, you'll keep blowing holes through the hide, and that causes all sorts of messiness, and you have to try and stitch the hide back up, and it just leads to ugliness. Getting a good clean hide removed from an animal requires an obtuse tip, almost 90 degrees, which is why you see butcher's knives have that really stout end. So by lowering the back slightly, we can actually, you can kind of see it here. If I were to lower this angle, the angle of the tip gets more and more obtuse. that would come down to the majority of use that that person's Puukko would see. Some even swept back more because that applies other uses as well. However, if you want a knife to go fishing and clean fish, a Puukko will do it. If you want a knife to go hunting large game like reindeer or elk, a Puukko will clean that animal. If you want to go after small game like rabbits and you need to be able to get in and get those very delicate fillets off of a rabbit, a Puukko will do it. If you need to whittle and carve intricate details in pieces of wood, a Puukko will do it. If you need to strip the bark off wood to use in construction, a Puukko will do it. Almost any task you could throw at this knife will be achieved by this knife, so long as it's made well. This was forged from high carbon steel. Sometimes the more modern ones are made with stainless steel because they see such rough use. You don't want them rusting on you. I like to stone wash mine if they're going to be seeing hard use. It does help a little bit with rust prevention, but carbon steel is just my jam. This one is 1084, which is my favorite steel. It can absolutely take a thrashing. This has a lot of finishing yet to do, and of course a handle added to it. Now the handles that you see traditionally are narrow right here, narrow at the base with a nice big oval shaped swell that sits in your hand, because these were not designed for stabbing. They didn't need a guard to stop your hands sliding up. It was always just a nice big swell in the middle because it was going to be used like this all the time with that forward pushing. Or you'll notice the back is very straight and very square, so it can be used to strike ferrocerium rods, but it's always sideways movement. So a nice sort of ovoid handle is often put on them, although it did come down a lot to the maker, and a lot of Finnish men would take great pride in carving and shaping their handles. If the handle was ivory, they might do scrimshaw inlay. If it was wooden, they would carve all sorts of beautiful knotwork and patterns and sometimes nature scenes in the handles, probably using another Puukko. And they're just incredibly versatile knives. And so I always recommend that people start with them, but people tend to get put off by the fact that they're quite plain, and they do look like a big steak knife. You compare that to some of the more modern looking knives, like this Raptor folding knife that I'm working on. You know, it's got a little bit of recurve in there to emphasize the belly, a nice clip point with the false edge and things, and it looks cooler, it looks visually cooler. That aggressive point you could never cleanly skin an animal with without extreme difficulty. Whittling would be tricky with a little bit of recurve in there. It would keep wanting to catch and you wouldn't be able to get clean carvings as easily. Obviously, it comes down a lot to the user and not the knife. But when it comes to an all-round knife that can do almost anything you throw at it, from eating to processing game to fishing to woodwork, it's just there for you. And Puukkos, I believe, are a testament to good knife design. And there's a reason that they've persisted throughout history for such a long time and become an icon. And frankly, copied by a lot of militaries around the world as well. So next time you're wanting to make a knife, put a little bit more thought into the design of function of that knife, because it's an unfortunate fact that a lot of knife makers don't regularly use knives. They don't get out and do bushcraft work. They don't hunt, they don't cook, and because of that, their knowledge of those knives and their function are purely theoretical. And I think that when it comes to knife theory, a Puukko is where it's at. It may be plain, it may be simple, but let me tell you, it'll get the job done. Thanks for stopping by. Just a quick video today to nerd out about my favorite style of knife. But if you want to follow me elsewhere, check out my Instagram and Facebook. I'm also on Patreon, where I give lots of business pro tips, so you can definitely check me out there. I also have a couple of Puukkos for sale. I'll put a link to my store down in the description below. Hope you're doing really well, and I'll catch you on the next video. Bye.
Definitely here, but it ain't so clear. it's definitely there, but I just can't tell where.